Hey everyone, this is Anvesh. Today I am going to show you how I created this small 5-second animated loop in Blender. I started with the ground. The ground is just a plane that is highly subdivided, and I added a cloud texture as displace modifier to get the subtle variation in the surface. And after ground, I created a bunch of trees. Now in order to create the trees, I use something called skin modifier. Now if if you see right, so all the geometry is basically made up of vertices, like there are no faces, and that's because skin actually creates the faces for it. And I prefer using skin modifier because it's easy to control it, and you can actually see like how it's affecting the scene. So once one of the tree was done, I duplicated it multiple times to set up the scene, and in no particular order, but whenever I had to build the scene, I refer to the camera view and try to build upon it. Since I knew that I was going to keep my camera static, it was easy for me to work that way. In order to make sure the look and feel was right, I started creating the materials right away. So if I go and hide this and this and go to the world, so it's nothing but a background image which was color corrected and then plugged into the background. So this is the world image, and this background is actually a hand painted PNG. Now if I go to the ground, I reuse the same image which is the background of PNG and plug that into the window because I was sure I was not going to move the camera, so either camera or window would have worked. I preferred window, and I changed the color of it based on the reference that I had, and then I plugged that into the diffuse. I was going for a cell shade kind of a look, and I was trying to avoid gradients as much as possible, and that could be possible if I actually use a shader like emission shader as the last thing that gets plugged into the surface of material output. Just to demo how that works, let me create a sphere, UV sphere, and change it to shade smooth. Now if you let me just hide this bloom and let me create a shader. That so this is a typical default principle BHDF, and this is how it looks like. If I reduce the color to a gray, so you can see that there is this gradient that's there. So one way to avoid it is by plugging that into a shader to RGB, and then change it to color ramp. So that way you can actually define this, you can define how the shadow is affecting. So something like this. Now you can always use this black and white map as a factor to define two different colors. Like say if I wanted to have an orange ball, so I will use a mix RGB. So the darker portion can be dark red, and the lighter portion can be like an orange. And again, all of this goes to the surface. You can even use a emission if you need. That way you can actually control the strength and brightness of it. So similarly, let me just turn these trees on. No, so this was the diffuse that I defined. I converted it to RGB, and then I tried to define the shadows a little bit more, and I used this shadow map as a factor to define the midtones and the shadows. So we have a default image. This is the brighter version which I'm using it for midtones and highlights, and this is the darker version of it. I'm using hue and value 0.2 and 2, right? And I plug this into the black and plug this into the white version to get this, and then I plug that into emission. So this is how I created the ground. Now you might be wondering why I used another pair of diffuse and shader RGB, right? So this was the midtone and this was the value. If I had clubbed this midtone into this mix, I would have got a shader like this. I would never have got the shininess, the brightness, even though the value is 2. So in order to leverage that, I plugged that into a diffuse and shader to RGB combination so that I got something like this for the midtone and highlights, which when I plug this into the mix, I get a better result of both brightness and a really dark shadow. And then this is the final way the ground looks like. I use similar kind of approach throughout the scene. Similarly, I made the trees. Now this shader might look a lot overwhelming, but it's pretty simple. But I might talk about it in detail maybe in a different video because it's going to take a lot of time. So just to summarize, I have a wave texture here. I have a different kind of wave texture. I combined both of them to make it non-uniform, and then I plugged the color ramp to define these, the texture that you might typically find on a tree. These like these loops and rings and all. And then I have this brown image. I have this texture image, and then I defined a darker version of it, and then this is the lighter version of it. So I can actually combine this darker and lighter version using this factor that we defined to create something like this. So this is the base tree texture. Now we defined two versions of it again. One is a darker version of this and the other is a brighter version of this, and it's the same exercise. Like I defined a diffuse here. Let's ignore the bloom for a minute, and then I switched it to shader RGB and I defined the shadows, and I use this midtone and shadow to use this dark and this bright value to finally combine it into a cell shading kind of a look, and then plug this into the emission. Once I got confident about the look and feel, I moved on to creating the next subject, which is the bear, this one. So I took it up as a challenge to create the bear using skin modifier similar to the trees that you saw earlier. Now if I go to the geometry, you will see that there are no faces, everything is vertices. If I see the values, right? So if here it's 0.5, 0.9, and then here it's 0.2, 0.6. So basically I can define the values to make the form. So even the head, neck, head, face, like all are defined using skin modifier, even the toes. And obviously I had to use mirror to mirror all the shape, and then I had to apply it because I was going to animate this. Similar to the bear's body, I made the eyes using skin, highlights of the eyes using skin, and even the nose using skin. So skin modified everywhere. Next, and then I animated the bear. So I used shape keys to animate it. Like I knew that all I had to do is like animate these portions of the hand and everything else can be static, because I was going for a cute loop kind of an animation, and I wanted the motion to be as subtle like the cinema graphs that you see online, right? I define a new shape key, which is this is 1, and then this is, wait a second, and then this is 0. So the idea was to keyframe one of the value, and then I added a noise modifier that gives random values to this shape key value. So it looks like as if it's drumming or as if it's typing, right? And then I changed this scale and strength so that it looked reasonable in motion. So something like this. And then I moved to creating the shader for the bear. Since we are dealing with vertices and not faces, we don't have anything to unwrap for this bear. Now if you notice, there is a slight variation in the mouth and the heel area. So here I have object coordinates. I can actually separate these object coordinates into XYZ. So this is what happens, like it travels from -1 to +1 in the X direction. And then if I go to the Y, let me enable this. Yeah, now you can see it clearly. So similarly, I can see for the Y, you can see it's traveling from -1 to 1 in the Y axis. And the same for Z. You might not notice because I'm guessing the 0 is somewhere in the top. Coming back to Y, and we know that the Y0 is here. Now we can subtract a value so that we can move this black to somewhere around here. This is what I'm doing. So the black gets moved to somewhere near the mouth, which is what I wanted. Now if I see it in the camera view, so yeah, so you can see that there is this black area and then this mouth area, but there's also black in the head. So I wanted to remove that. That way is possible if I try to subtract it in the Z direction. I can get the gradient till the mouth. So I have a different separate XYZ, and then I took the Z value and then I subtracted it with a number. I basically moved the 0 to the bottom by subtracting it. Now when I mix these two values, and this is the kind of gradient that I'm getting. Again, all of these values were done after I combine this mix so that I can actually precisely control this value. And once I define this, I plugged it into a color ramp with constant as a value so that I can define like sharp boundaries for these two. Now I have a mask, black and white mask, which I can use it as a factor to combine a brighter and a darker value of colors. To create the base texture, I used the texture that I had created for the tree. You can see it's the same one, and as you might have expected, I plugged it into a window because my bear is not moving and I wanted to have a texture that resembles something that you would draw on a paper, right? So that won't move. So yeah, so I changed the hue to a one version of a brown, and then I created a different version of a brown, a little more saturated, and then I combine this and these two different colors using the factor of this mask to create a base texture of this. Now the next step is, like you might have expected already, is to create the shadows. So for that I defined a diffuse BHDF, I changed it to shader RGB, and then I tweaked the ramp so that I can actually highlight this area. Now you might notice that a lot of portion of this bear is in dark. I wanted to do that because since I was using skin node, if I hadn't done that, you would have seen artifacts in the shape. So now we have the highlight, midtone, and the shadow, and I created this two different shaded versions of this base. One is darker variant, and for the other, instead of doing a brighter variant, I used this black and white map, and using this white, I'm overlaying it on top of the base color that we have. Now I had to use this method because I wanted to get a kind of a glare which I'm going to use in compositing. So I am using glare and I have a threshold of 0.5. So this setting it to 2 or 3 helps me to get a kind of a faint glow on top of the head and the arm areas. And then the overall thing is plugged into the emission shader. So this is how I made the bear. And similarly I used emission for the eyes and the highlights of the eye, and I used a darker version of the same texture to the mouth. Next I made the rocks in the laptop. So if I turn this on, so I made a few rocks. For this I didn't use skin modifier. I mean I could have used, but it didn't occur to me, and I thought shaping a cube is much easier than making it using skin modifier. So it's just a cube, highly subdivided, and a couple of different variants of the same rock. scaled and all. And then I made this laptop using cube, and difficult to build using a skin modifier, because in that case you won't be getting these kind of edges, these kind of rounded edges. And then I added a area lamp to the scene, and then I created these tiny little earphones. Now again we are back to skin modifier. So this is done by skin, and then this is done by skin, and even the earphone stands are done using skin. And all of these have like really high subdivision counts to make the strand smoother. So this is the modeling part of it, and the color is straightforward, like most of them are. If I see, yeah, so this is the earphone, diffuse, shader, color ramp, trying to plug a shadow for this, like, so this is the fact. Let's see, yeah, so here we have a factor of black and white, and this is the white, so white goes into white, and for the black I'm using this kind of a off white or a little bluish color to get this kind of a look, and then plugging it to emission. Same for the other one, and same for the strands. This logo that looks like an apple, and again I didn't want to UV unwrap, so I wanted to make this procedurally. If you really want to know, I can make another video just explaining this on how I created this. But to summarize, again we have object coordinates, and then we can define x and y and z, right? So using the equation of x square plus y square equals to r square, I can actually create this, and then I can add these to create a circle, and then I can use color dodge and color burn to fine-tune this circle. Similarly, I create a second version of this circle which is slightly offset to the right. Now I can subtract this circle from the leftmost circle to get something like this shape, and I am clamping it so that the you won't get a different kind of a color or different kind of a glow here. Similarly, I gathered one circle on the top and using color dodge to reduce the size, and then color burn to sharpen it, and then creating a different version of it, a little offset, and then try to make an intersection of it that creates a leaf. Again, like you might remember this in any other boolean ways, like in Photoshop or Illustrator, the way you try to use pathfinder, right? So it's something similar to that. And I can invert this, and then I can add both of these while using clamp every time, and then I can multiply this so that the black is still black but the white has a brighter value, and this will be used by the bloom and also in the glare in the compositing. The rest of the gray and all, again I had to use diffuse. So diffuse gives you a gradient, and then I can convert that to RGB, and then instead of two colors I can actually add multiple colors to refine this highlight and shadow and mid-tone. I guess this is the first place where I'm introducing three different levels of color or grayness. And then this is the mix of it, like I'm using this black and white mask as as a factor to mix the glowing part of it and to mix the metal part of it. So we have the laptop. For the rocks, it's the same thing. I used the existing textures that we had and plugged it into a window, and then using the cell shading method I prepared these rocks. I added a little tint of blue everywhere, like even on the trees and the bear and the earphone and the rock and everywhere. So yeah, so we almost are done with our entire scene, and next we can move to the bush and grass. So bush and grass are nothing but planes. If I expand, yeah, so I added a bunch of planes in different distances from the camera. And then same for the grass are like the smaller ones that you see in front of the rocks. And if I go to shading, so for these bush planes I created separate images, and I used alpha to plug the transparency, so that we got only this colored portion visible. These were the images that I'm using for the texture, like bush 2 and bushes. So I made a bunch of them and tried to randomize this, and then I scaled them so that it fits in the scene. Same for the grass. The last addition to the scene was this rabbit. Where is it? Yeah, so here's the rabbit hiding behind the bear. It's like a backpack, like a bunny pack. Yeah, so now it's visible here. Again, the same old routine, like done using skin modifier. One of the advantages of this method was I could easily bind these vertices to these bones. Like for example, if you notice, right, this vertex is mapping to this bone, and then this vertex is mapping to both of these two bones, and this one is mapping with this particular bone. So that way it was easy for me to map. I didn't even have to do weight painting. I just clicked on the vertex and assigned the values, and then all I had to do is like animate the armature. And this animation was done using keyframes. I won't be able to talk about it, like it's a completely different video perhaps. And I'm using an empty to reveal it from different positions. Like it starts from this frame, it peeps behind the bear, it looks at the laptop, and then it hides. Let me see where the empty is. So this is the x y z. Yeah, so it's moving in x and z, so it's static from the beginning, and then it moves, something happens, it goes back to a hiding state, and then it reveals again. Anyways, so this is the entire scene. And coming to the shading, is the rabbit, nothing major, like same thing, diffuse shader, all mix of colors and all. So the final thing to improve was the depth of field and the ambience. I added a cube, purple or violet color. This shadow was a failed attempt at me trying to create this kind of a leaf texture procedurally, and then to cut the light that's appearing in the scene, like on the ground and on the trees. And I even tried to animate this, but it just didn't work. So I just dropped the plan. It's not in the final render. So this is the entire scene that I did. It kind of looks really good in the viewport also. I'm kind of proud of it. Like this is I would say one of my good ones in recent months maybe. Now coming to the render settings, I rendered it at 64. I included bloom. I decreased the tile size to 2, and then I increased the cube size to 2048, both the cube and the cascade size 2048. I prefer medium high and what do you call, gamma at 0.95, so that I don't have to change it again in After Effects or some other software. And one thing that I would like to say is when you're trying to work with NPR, it's always better if you use a standard transform instead of Filmic, because let me show how it will appear if I'm using Filmic. You see all the colors are dulled down, and since we are not going for realism, so the colors are not going to blow, so it doesn't really matter. So it's always better to use standard when you're trying to work with NPR. And that's how I created this scene. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. If I have missed any of the steps, let me know and maybe I can add them in the future videos. And like I tried to skip some of the parts because including them within this video is going to be too lengthy and it will be difficult to keep track of what's happening in the project. So I try to avoid it. If you feel like it'd be worth mentioning, let me know in the comments and I will try to maybe create a different video for it. Especially I'm looking at the apple and the tree textures that we have. So yeah, see you in the next video. Thank you.